So today's discussion, based on the Hegyonei Halacha of Rabbi Yitzchak Mirsky Shlita, will address the relationship between Teshuva and Viduy. And amongst the various issues that hopefully we'll address today is, number one, are they two parts of one whole, or they're two separate entities? Is there Teshuva without Viduy? And what is the purpose of Viduy? What is the nusach of Viduy? What are the requirements thereof? Are we dealing with the Doraisa? Are we dealing with the Drabanan? And etc. There are even more issues that I didn't even mention, but that's just the focal point and putting everything into a framework, a perspective. The Rambam clearly indicates in many places in its writings, both in Hilchos Teshuva and in the Sefer Mitzvos, that Viduy is a Doraisa. It's a requirement that the Rambam derives from a pasuk at the beginning of Sefer Bamidbar. At the end of Parshas Bamidbar, the Torah says, "Ish o isha asher yasu mikol chatas hadam visvadu es chatasam asher osu." And the Rambam sees in this pasuk a source for the mitzvah Viduy min Torah. However, as Rav Yerucham Fischel Perla points out in his commentary on the Sefer Mitzvahs, the Bahag, Baal Halachas Gedolos, has classified the mitzvah of Viduy as the Rabbanan. And the only element min Torah of Viduy, which is indicated in that pasuk that we quoted, is part and parcel of a greater whole. It's a detail in the mitzvah of Karban. So when a person brings a Karban, as part of that great mitzvah of Karban that has many, many different parts to it, one part is Viduy. That's it for the Doraisa. So if you're talking about Viduy Doraisa, according to the Baal Halachas Gedolos, you're talking about Karban. That's Viduy Doraisa. Beyond that, we don't have a source for Viduy independent, outside of the purview of Karban, min Torah. Any requirement of Viduy that we find in Masechta Yoma with regard to Teshuva, that's all D'Rabbanan, according to the Bahag. The Gemara, towards the end of Yoma on Daf Pei Zayin, discusses the Nusach HaViduy. What is the formulation of Viduy, the barest minimum requirement? And the Gemara establishes that all you have to recite is three words: Aval, Anachnu, Chatanu. And this is based on a story that the Gemara relates in the name of some Amora by the name of Bar Hamiduri, who witnessed Shmuel in the Beis HaKnesses when he was sitting at davening. When the shots recited Aval, Anachnu, Chatanu, Shmuel stood up on his feet. And Bar Hamiduri understood that the reason why Shmuel stood up on his feet is to fulfill the mitzvah of Viduy. So that when Shmuel heard the shots, and maybe perhaps repeated after the shots, Aval, Anachnu, Chatanu, he stood up to fulfill the mitzvah of Viduy. Imagine, this very sophisticated mitzvah that has so many different aspects to it can be fulfilled with three words: Aval, Anachnu, Chatanu. The Rama, in the second chapter of Hilchos Teshuva, when he formulates the nusach of Viduy, Shenagu bo kol Yisrael, Aval, Anachnu, Chatanu, following the story of Bar Hamiduri and Shmuel at the end of Masechta Yoma. But the Lechem Mishnah says that what the Rama meant by Aval Avosenu Aval Anachnu Chatanu is Aval Anachnu Chatanu, etc. Because the Rambam earlier had mentioned that there are three categories of sin: there's Chet, Avon, and Pesha. So it's Aval Anachnu Chatanu, Avinu Pashanu. That's the Nusach HaViduy, the way the Lechem Mishnah understands the Rambam. Again, I don't think we have to accept the Lechem Mishnah necessarily. The Rambam says, Aval Anachnu Chatanu. Now, what does the word Aval mean? The word Aval in Hebrew grammar always appears in the middle of a sentence. You begin with something, and in contrast, you say but, aval. Here, we have a very exceptional case where the word aval appears at the very beginning of a statement. Nothing came before this statement. And truth be told, this problem bothered some of the Mefarshim to such extent that they understood that aval is really in the middle of a sentence. What comes before the word aval? Elokeinu ve'elokei avoseinu tzadikim anachnu, meaning we won't have the brazen chutzpah to declare we are tzadikim. Aval anachnu chatonu. We are not tzadikim, but we sin. However, although that might be true, it's not true. And I rarely use that kind of language when I hear something. But in this case, the Gemara never has this long viduy of Elokeinu ve'elokei avoseinu, and we're not chutzpahdik to say and claim we're tzaddikim. That is a much later nusach, and it was integrated into what's called Hashamnu Bagadnu, the long viduy, but that's not the ikar nusach haviduy. We want to truncate and get the quintessential requirement of viduy in its very simple and narrow form. It's aval anachnu chatanu. Nothing more. We do not have to have any introduction. However, question is, how can you start a sentence with the word aval? What does aval mean? And in order to get an insight, a grasp on the word aval, we quote two psukim in the Torah. One is in Parshas Vayera, when Avram Avinu is accosted. Why did you tell us that she is your sister, Sarah? And there it says, Aval Sarah ishtecha, but Sarah is your wife, not your sister. Here you have a sentence in Breshis Perek Yud Zayin that begins with the word Aval. Second example, with regard to the Achim of Yosef, and they go through all the torment that Yosef puts them through, we find in Perek Mem Beis in Breshis, the brothers recite Aval Hashem Emanachnu. Now we're getting very close to the Nusach HaVidui, and the sentence opens with the word Aval. So we see clearly from a number of psukim in Tanakh that the word Aval could appear at the beginning of a sentence. Rashi explains that the word Aval means emes, and he derived it from Targum Onkelos, who translates the word Aval as kushta, bekushta, in truth. And we'll get an even deeper insight into the meaning of the word Aval in Viduy from the Breshis Rabbah. Here's what it says in the Medrash regarding Achei Yosef. And if you happen to have the pages and you like to follow inside, it's at the top of page 170. Vayomru ish el echav. One brother turns to the other, and they all say, Aval Hashem b'manach. And the word Aval means emes. God is now bringing upon us a punishment for what we know to be true is our guilt. Aval Hashem b'manach. We are not in that mindset that we were in the past, where we justified our actions and we sold our brother, he deserved to be sold, blah, blah, blah. No. Aval. The truth is, anachnu ashamnu. We acted in a criminal way, and that's the emes. Hashem anachnu. We are guilty. And hence, everything that befalls us and all the suffering that we're going through is justified. We could bring another support for this from Rabbeinu Bechai's commentary in Parshas Vayeshev. And he says that the word avol is a word that indicates hoda'ah. Hoda'ah means confession. Avol, he says, nachon. Nachon is like emes. Omnam kain, meaning, yes, it is so. Hashem emanach. Says Rabbeinu Bechai, ubazeh, nagu ha'achim ki derech hatzadikim. What's the derech hatzadikim in the context of tshuva? We're going to derive that from the brothers of Yosef. Hakaras achet. They concede, they recognize and acknowledge their sin, their guilt. Kishechotim, the tzadikim, when they sin, modim bechetam. It seems so elementary, Rabbosai, but it's not. It's not a simple matter. Man has a natural tendency to deny sin and to find all sorts of excuses, alibis, attributions attributed to this, attributed to him, or to that. No, the tzaddikim are modim bechetam, says Rabbeinu Bechai. That's a great act of the tzaddikim. And therefore, matzdikim alem es hadin. They justify God's righteousness by indicating that, yes, we are guilty. Shelo kederech harishayim, says Rabbeinu Bechai, the Rishayim are just the opposite. When you confront them with their actions, their failings, makchishim es achet, they deny that it's a sin. The Omrim, and they say, machatanu, that's not a chet. And he demonstrates this beautifully with a pasuk in Tanakh, in Sefer Zechariah, Asher koneim ye'aragun v'lo yeshamu. They're guilty of murder, but they will not blame themselves. They will not confess sin. Hodah b'chet is critical, and that's what Viduy is about. The avol is a hodah b'chet. Avol. Everything that has happened to us and all our suffering and the punishment that was brought upon us is avol. It's nachon adover. It's emes. God is the righteous God. Kel emunah ve'en avel. And we are matzdik the din the very moment that we admit avol, nachon, emes. Everything that happens to us is emes. And that hodas hachet is reflective of tzaddikim, because the Rishayim have the opposite response to chet. You accost them and you present them with their sins, and they deny it. They make nothing of it. And now we have a piece from Rav Alba, one of the Rishonim. He authored, of course, the book Sefer HaIkrim, which is all built around the basic tenets of our faith. And he has a whole chapter on Darkei Tshuva. How do we go about fulfilling the mitzvah of tshuva? In that presentation, he incorporates Viduy as hakaras hachet, recognizing sin, and that is the beginning, the kickoff, the essential jumping point for tshuva. Viduy, he says. And you know, he says, Rav Alba, you know what's mafsid, what's ma'akiv tshuva? Is to malim hachet, hachote malim escheto. He covers it over, a cover-up. He hides his sin. V'lo yisnatzel olav. He says that the real derech hatshuva is when you don't find hitnatzlut, which means excuses. Eliyodeh b'leiv shalem, with a full heart, he admits guilt. He recognizes his failings. Vastaras hachet, when he hides his sin, monea es ha'adam, it prevents him from tshuva. There's no acknowledgement of sin. And basically, the denial of sin is like a chetz, it's like a shield, a barrier that prevents him from reaching tshuva. And therefore, we find in Sefer Hosea, says Rav Alba, Rav Yosef Alba, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu, through the mouth of Hosea Navi, castigates and rebukes the people of Israel, he says to them, Elech, I'm out of here, says the Ribono Shel Olam. Ashuv el makomi, I'm going back, and I'm going to desert the people of Israel. I'm going back up to my high place. Why? Ad asher yashemu ubakshu panai. Until yashemu, yashmu means they will find themselves guilty. And by the way, I would add a footnote here in Chasidus, it's very big, that when a person judges himself and evaluates his sin, then he saves himself from mishpat on high. God only judges him on high because he fails to judge himself down here on earth. Says Rav Yosef Albo, you know what this pasuk means? HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I'm going to ignore the people of Israel. As Oves Yisrael, I'm out of here. Ad asher yeshomu. Ad asher yakiru bechetam v'yachziku es atzmam ashemim v'chatoim. V'oz, when they acknowledge their sin, their guilt, Yeshuva b'tshuva, Yevakshu panai, and I'll be there with him. And Rav Albo writes, it's very difficult, naturally, for a person to admit guilt. A human being has a natural tendency of finding himself guiltless, innocent. I declare myself innocent. Mamtzi lo tshuvos v'teirutzav amaslos lahatzdik masha asa. In order to confess sin and acknowledge sin and guilt, all of Lisgaber, he has to overcome netius nafsha. Umatzanu, he says, Gedolim, shenichshalu b'davar zeh. Even the greats fell short of being able to overcome the natural tendency to justify their actions and confess guilt. Eloli achar shechatu bikchu lahalim es hachet lechasososo. They tried to hide sin. They couldn't get the energy, the psychological energy to confess sin, and tolu es hasmara esibas hachet ba'acherim. They always find something outside themselves to attribute to sin. And therefore, niskiru sharei tshuva l'fnei. And he concludes his presentation of Albo with the pasuk, famous pasuk in Mishlei, Mechasep Chavlo Yatzliach Umodev Yozev Yerucham. So where do we find this in history, in Tanakh? We begin with the first sinner and the first sin. HaKadosh Baruch Hu comes to Adam in Gan Eden, and after the sin, HaKadosh Baruch Hu asks him a number of questions. Ayeka, Mazel Sasisa, Hamina Eisa Shertzivisicha, Lebilti Achol Mimeno Achalta. You know, God is like playing Damavad, as we call it in Yiddish. Says the Sforno, why is God asking all these questions? Kidei Limoshcho L'tshuva. Come and do tshuva. I'm inviting you to do tshuva. So what does Adam Arishon say? Ha'isha asher nasata imodi hi nasto limen ha'etz va'ochal. And there's an amazing comment in the Sforno on this pasuk. He says, Yiches ashmaso lekono. Bad enough that he doesn't blame himself. And he blames his wife, but moreover, he blames God. Asher nasata imodi. Don't we all do this? God, you gave her to me. V'achakach ba'kodesh baruch hu b'chvodo v'atzmo. Bad enough that he's not modeh, he doesn't do tshuva, but he blames HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Tana sata es ha'isha azos imod. Beautiful and so true, a comment of the Sfarim. And as a result of this terrible sin, which he doubles, in other words, by blaming God, the principle of Mavir Rishon, that usually God overlooks the first time you do a sin until you do it repeatedly, that principle is suspended with regard to Adabar Rishon. He will be punished severely for the first sin, Lefisha Hiktin Cheto, because he doubled his sin by minimalizing it. V'lo ra es chataso kenegdo. He didn't recognize the sin. He blamed HaKadosh Baruch Hu. All that piles up like one sin after the other. And to say, no, she caused my sin, that doubles the Avera almost. Then we get to Shaul HaMelech. Almost the same story repeats itself. The great Shaul HaMelech. He was sent to destroy Amalek. Mishar v'ad Seh, migamal v'ad Chamor, mi'oel ad yonek v'isha ad isha, and he fails to destroy Amalek the way he was commanded to do so. Now it's interesting. The pasuk in Shmuel Aleph Perek Tesvav records that Shaul said the word chatasi, and yet Chazal say that his tshuva was not accepted. Why? The answer is that Shmuel says Nichamti ki imlachti et Shaul HaMelech. God is so upset, he's so makbid on Shaul, that he regrets that he appointed Shaul as the Melech. And Shmuel asks Shaul, why didn't you listen to what I told you? And Shaul says, Shamati b'kol Hashem. I fulfilled the will of God. And Shmuel says, what are you talking about? You fulfilled the will of God. What are all these sounds that I hear? You know what? You deny that you sin? Says Shmuel to Shaul, Ki chatas kesem meri. Kesem meri means your refusal to admit sin and confess your guilt. That itself is a chet. And it's compared to the chet of a kosem. A kosem is a magician or a witch, a machshefa, which is so despicable in the eyes of God. And after Shaul hears these very strong, heavy words of rebuke, Shaul says, Chatasi ki avarti es pi Hashem v'estvarech. Shaul finally, at the end of the day, says Chatasi, and he recognizes the sin. Too late, Shaul. You should have responded immediately and confessed your sin. And then, to mess things up even worse, Shaul adds another sentence. Ki aresi es ha'am. I was afraid of the people. V'eshma b'kolam. And I listened to what they had to say. Asher chamal ha'am al meitiv hatzon v'habaka. And according to the Gemara, they claimed, why are we killing the women? Why are we killing the children? They didn't sin. And Shaul, only at the very end of this back and forth between Shmuel HaNavi and Shaul, only then does he say Chatasi without any excuses. But now it's a little bit too late. But we have a paradigm of the Baal Tshuva, the great Baal Tshuva. And you guessed it, it's none other than David HaMelech. David HaMelech becomes the trailblazer, the absolute example that we have to emulate for Teshuva and Viduy. Because immediately after the Maisa of Bathsheba, he could have given any number of excuses, like the Gemara says in Ksubis, that a person who goes to battle gives a get krisus before he goes out. David could have given all the excuses. And instead, David, in contrast to the Rishon, in contrast to Shaul HaMelech, immediately chatasi l'Hashem, without any excuses. He's not covering over his sin. He recognizes his sin immediately. And the Gemara says that chata adam umevakesh lashuv omrim lo klach eitzel yachid. Go to this individual, the Gemara says, in Masechta Avodah Zarah Daf Daled. And who is this yachid? It's David HaMelech. Learn from David HaMelech what Teshuva and Viduy is all about. And the Medrash says that basically David was a tikkun for Adam HaRishon. Adam HaRishon was meant to live, says the Medrash, for 1,000 years. He only lived 930 years. 70 years were taken away from Adam HaRishon, and they were granted to David HaMelech, who died at the age of 70. So David HaMelech rectifies the sin of Adam HaRishon. Now, the Mefarshim asked the following question. We said that Viduy should be Chatasi or Visi Pashati. David HaMelech only says Chatasi. And yet the Gemara says we should learn Viduy and Teshuva from David HaMelech. Why? If David only said Chatasi. So here we have a brilliant, brilliant insight of the Vilna Gaon. And he built himself on a pasuk in Tehillim. We are now on page 173. Says the Gaon, I'm going to prove to you that David HaMelech was about to recite Viduy, Chatasi Avisi Pachat. But he stopped prematurely. Why? As soon as he recited the word Chatasi, says the Gaon, Nishbar libo bekirbo. His heart broke down. He had a breakdown. The Ra bochein kloyes v'leiv, God in heaven saw es kniyaso v'kibel es chuvaso hevir es chatoso, and God accepted his David Viduy as if he had said Chatasi Avisi Pashat. Who stopped David in the middle of his sentence and didn't allow David to complete it, knowing that God had accepted the word Chatasi? It was none other than Nasan HaNavi. Nasan HaNavi stops him after the word Chatasi. He says, Dayecha, you've said enough. Your Viduy is accepted. And your sin is removed. And for this, we open up to Perek Lamed Beis, easy to remember, Lev, of Tehillim, chapter 32, verse 5. Says David, Chatasi, I have sinned. Odiacha, I will notify you. Meaning, I will make note of my chet. The avoni lo kisisi, I did not cover up my avon. Amarti odeh olai pish'i lashem, I had decided to recite a confession of my pesha lashem. V'ata nasasa avon chatasi sel. Very strange pasuk. Says the God, This is the remez to exactly what happened. David turns to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He says, Chatasi odiacha va'avoni lo kisisi. I really wanted to continue my viduy and add avon, avisi. Amarti ode the Omer gam pashati. My decision was to add the word pashati. But ve'ata Hashem nasasa v'salachta lavoni be'omri chatasi bilvad. Beautiful shot in the post. You have to see it inside. Now here we have a Gavaldi Akasha from the Meir La'olam, Rab Meir Michael Rabinovich. And he says the following. How can David HaMelech serve as the paradigmic case of Teshuva and Viduy? The Gemara tells us at the end of Masechta Sanhedrin, in Perek Chelek, Kuf Zayin, that David says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu all sorts of justifications. What we call hitztadkut, when he finds excuses. The Gemara says, Omar David L'fnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Goli v'yadu l'fanecha, shayisi achol l'natzeach es yitzri. If I were to be left to my own brothers, I would have overcome my yetzer. Ella, there's a quote from the Gemara, Shelo yomru avda zachi lemeria. That the Eved was victorious over his master. Well, what exactly is going on? David says to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, B'chanani Hashem v'nisani. God put me into a trial, a nisayon, and I withstood the nisayon. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, quote, Lo uchal lamod b'nisayon. David says, God declared that I will not, meaning David will not be able to overcome the temptation. And hiyata chatasi. In fact, I sinned. But why? Says David, pasuk in Tanakh, leman titzdak dvarecha, so that you, God, will turn out to be right. Kidei sheyu dvarecha emes, because if I wouldn't sin, nimtzenu divrei HaKadosh Baruch Hu shav. God had declared, I'll show you who's boss. I'm going to put you in a test, and you're going to fail the test. And David did not want to make HaKadosh Baruch Hu into a liar, and therefore he deliberately failed the test. But he had the ability to overcome his yetzer. V'masha chatasi, says David, lo chatasi ela b'chtei la'ames es dvarecha she'amarta ki lo uchal la'amod b'nisayon. David HaMelech is giving the greatest excuse in the world. God, I did it for you. I sinned on your behalf. So that you, God, should not become a liar. Because you said, Lo uchal lamod b'nisayon. So the Meir HaOlam asks the obvious question. How could the Gemara point to David HaMelech as the outstanding paradigm of Teshuva and Viduy that we should emulate when it's David HaMelech who comes up with this excuse, a whole lumbus, that you said, God, this, and therefore I had to sin. Says the Meir HaOlam, there are tzvei dinim in justifying one's actions. Two parts to Teshuva. One part is the hodah itself, when you recognize sin. When you are encountering sin, meaning, I'm going to use the word accosted. I don't know what better word, there's probably a better word. But when the Navi comes to you and he says, you sinned, at that point, there are no justifications. It's pure, 100% hodah. Yes, I sinned. However, at a later stage, there's another dimension to Teshuva, and that's called Bakoshas Mechila. I petition the Almighty to accept my Teshuva. Says the Meir HaOlam, at that level, a person has all the license in the world to find whatever justifications he has and he can to pull out of his pocket to justify what he did and to try to minimize the onesh and to achieve kapara. And in the same chapter in Tehillim that we quoted before, it says, Haster panecha michatasi v'chol avonosi mocha. Mechei, excuse me. That in that very same context, David HaMelech asks God to be mochel and wipe off his sin. That's already Bakoshes Mechila. In Bakoshes Mechila, that's when you find justifications and excuses to try to minimize the sin. But initially, David HaMelech just said Chatasi, because initially when he was confronted with the sin, he's not going to try to make it a lighter sin. That he can't do, but rather Pishi Ani Eida V'Chatasi Negdi Samid, I confess my sin. Personally, Rabbosai, I'm not trying to in any way detract from the words of the Meir La'olam. They're beautiful, but I think it's a lot deeper than all that. And I believe that there are situations in which HaKadosh Baruch Hu puts a person into a nisayon in a way that God already knows up front that he's going to fail the test. And it's part of a divine plan. And this touches on the whole issue of Yediyah and Bechira. And I gave a shir about this once. It was quite a number of years ago. It was based on the what was the name of that sefer? It just flew out of my mind. Okay, it'll pop into my head. There's a certain sefer that speaks about situations in which God knows that man will sin, and God actively puts man in the situation where he will sin. It's a very deep concept. And there's a divine plan. God needed David HaMelech to be the paradigm of tshuva, and therefore he put David HaMelech into a situation knowing up front that David would sin. Again, a very deep concept. You know, there's a member of my community who would tell me immediately where, his name is Jackie Zippel, but I don't have access to Jackie. But anyway, you'll ask me later on what the name of the sefer is, but it's all right, anyway. So again, let's just review and emphasize Rav Yosef Albo's sefer, the Bala Ikrim. And he says that if a person doesn't recognize his sin, if he doesn't regret, it's almost impossible for him to do tshuva. Imagine a person, chas shalom, is a chola, and he cannot acknowledge that he's a chola. He's not going to take any trufa, any medicines, or administer any therapy. He doesn't know that he's ill. I mean, that's the greatest gift that God gave us. We have symptoms. If we don't have any symptoms, or if we fool ourselves into thinking that we don't have any symptoms, then we're not going to be able to take medicine. And I want to show you something really, really interesting here on the bottom of page 174. This was a big chiddush for me. If a person knows that he sinned in what's called a chiyuv kares, then he has to bring a karban chatas. A karban chatas, the Gemara tells us, is worth ma'a achas, one ma'a. If he's in doubt as to whether he ate chelev or shuman, he brings a karban asham talui. an Ashen Talui is worth 2 Slayim. Now, 1 Sela equals 48 Mos. 2 Slayim is close to 100 Mos. That's almost 100 times the value of a Karban Chatas. So Rabbeinu Yonah, in his commentary on Brachos, says the following, that when he knows he sinned, then he's able to do tshuva, knowing that he sinned, even with a ma. But in a Safek Avera, in his mind, he keeps thinking, no, I didn't eat chelev, I ate shuman. It's very hard for him to do tshuva. So we send him a message that he should pay attention to what happened. He put himself into the Safek situation. He shouldn't have eaten one of 2 pieces, one of which is chelev. And therefore, since he's not makir becheto, Rabbeinu Yonah says, you need hakaras hachet, therefore the Torah is much more harsh with him in the absence of hakaras hachet. There's a statement of the Ran regarding the long Viduy of Hashem. And he says the following. When we stand in front of the Bezdin Shel Mala and we recite Viduy, what we'll see here is just the opposite of Bezdin Shel Mata. My high. In Bezdin Shel Mata, if Ruvain, the plaintiff, sues Shimon, the defendant, in a Bezdin, in a court, then if Shimon denies the claim, then he's off the hook if there's no evidence against him. If, on the other hand, he confesses his crime, then he'll have to pay up. Hodas Baldin. In Bezdin Shel Mala, it's just the reverse, says the Ran. If he'll deny his sin, he's in very bad shape. Oy vavoilo. If he admits his sin, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu will be compassionate and let him off the hook. The Sfaradim have an interesting minhag. They have a very long nusach of Viduy. And it's all based on that pasuk that we saw before, David HaMelech. Chatasi odiacha, avoni lo kisisi, amarti ode olai pishi lashem. And therefore, viata, nasas avon chatasi sel. You will now forgive me for all eternity. And then, citing the end of the pasuk, michaseb shav lo yatzliach umode ve'ozev yeruch. We have a minhag of clapping al chet, of banging on our chest, on the heart. Now, when should he bang on his chest? During the al chet. The Mishnah Berurah writes in Shulchan Aruch Siman Taf Reish Zayin that he should bang on his chest when he gets to the end of that sentence, of that verse. Bilash and Hara hit himself on the chest. However, Rav Yair Bachrach, who's famous for many works, but he wrote also a sefer called Makar Chayim, Yidfok bi'omro chatanu, al chet shechatanu lefanech. When he says the word chatanu, that's what he should bang on his chest. I'm not sure, but I think, please correct me if I'm wrong, that that's our minhag. Not like the Mishnah Berurah. Am I right? Al chet shechatanu lefanech. I think. I don't know. Maybe there are 2 minhag. But I was a little bit disappointed. I was anticipating that Rabbi Mirsky would give me some insight into the Shita of Rav Bachrach, which I think is our minhag. It seems to me that Pirut HaChet, at the end, when you say B'kach HaShokad or or B'lashon Hara, B'litzanus, etc., etc., that really is not the ikar part of Viduy. Viduy is Chatanu, or Chatasi. And the word Chatasi is an all-encompassing word. Any chait fits under the word Chatasi. And therefore, when you recite the Viduy, then every time you say the word Chatasi or Chatanu, that is the Viduy. That's when you should be clapping on your leg. The period achet that comes at the end after Chatanu, that's already a secondary matter. That's not the Iker Viduy. I don't know. Now we get to our original Chakira that I mentioned at the beginning of the Shir, if you remember. What is the relationship between Viduy and Teshuva? Are they two separate elements and they each exist independent of the other, or it's one entity? There's no Teshuva without Viduy. Viduy and Teshuva are one entity. So could there be Teshuva without Viduy? Again, if Viduy and Teshuva are two separate entities, then you could have a Teshuva. Maybe it's not the best Teshuva, it's not ideal, but it could exist without Viduy. If on the other hand, Viduy and Teshuva are one entity, they're both two critical elements that we can't, none of them are indispensable, both of them are absolutely critical. The Rambam seems to indicate that there are two separate entities. The Rambam's language in Perek Aleph Milchus Teshuva, he says, "V'chein balei chatos v'ashamos ein miskaper lehem bekarbanam ad sheyasu teshuva v'yisvadu viduy dvar." The Rambam has two elements over here. He says, number one, there's a requirement of teshuva, and number two, there's a requirement of viduy. It would seem, according to the Rambam, that these are two independent elements. And if a person was shav belibo without enunciating viduy, but he had a sincere inner teshuva, that would be meaningful. And that would count as teshuva, because teshuva can exist independent of viduy. But the question is, how would the Rambam know such a thing? And here we have a very, very famous sugya in Masechta Kiddushin on Daf Mem Tes Amud Beis. We all know this Gemara. Ha'omer li'isha, hareat mekudeshes li almanach shani tzadik gomor, afilu rasha kol yoma. Rasha gomor mikudeshes. We're on the top page 176 for anyone who's following the text. Why? The guy's a Rasha. And he made a condition that the Kiddushin should be chal if he's a tzaddik. Says the Gemara, we all know this Gemara, Shema hirer tshuva b'daito. Maybe he did tshuva b'daito in his mind. That's why they tell Eidim, when they come up for Kiddushin under the chuppah, they tell him to be maharer, meaning maharer b'tshuva, not other kinds of hirurim. In today's world, whatever. The one who made this Gemara famous, in my humble opinion, was the Minchas Chinuch. The Minchas Chinuch asks the obvious question: how can the Gemara say that Chayshina l'Kiddushin? Because maybe he had a Hirut Tshuva, but where's the Viduy? The Rambam writes that there's no kapara without Viduy. So how can he be considered a tzaddik? Because of Hirut Tshuva Belibo, without Viduy, he hasn't achieved kapara. Says the Minchas Chinuch, there are two directions to time. There's the past and there's the future. Kapara is a concept that belongs to the past. When he implemented that criminal act and violated the Torah, he incurred a chiyuv of an onesh. And now he can retroactively remove that onesh through tshuva, but only if he has viduy accompanying the tshuva. Viduy is ma'akev, it's an integral and essential part of tshuva as a machaper to achieve kapara for the past. But as far as the status of the individual moving forward to the future, There's tshuva without viduy. Tshuva could change his status even without viduy. Shemehir tshuva b'daito, even though retroactively he has not removed the onesh, because he cannot achieve kapara without viduy. The Gemara says that chayshina l'kedushin. Why? Because his condition was that he's a tzaddik. He is a tzaddik. He has now transformed himself from a rasha to a tzaddik based on hir tshuva without viduy. Ask me, will he be punished for his sins? The answer is yes, because he has not recited viduy, and viduy is a critical element in kapara. We have two dinim. This is like, the Minchas Chinuch must have learned in Brisk. Well, he was before Brisk. Our Rebbe told us that amongst the very few svarim that Reb Chaim had on his desk, one of them was the Minchas Chinuch. And I see why. The Minchas Chinuch is saying that viduy and its relationship to tshuva is bifurcated. On the one hand, viduy is necessary when tshuva is meant to achieve the goal of kapara, to remove the onesh and protect himself from the punishment. On the other hand, tshuva stands alone, even without viduy, independent of viduy, to change the status of the person from that of a rasha and transform him into being a tzaddik. Wow, very profound. If you'll allow me, and even if you won't allow me, I'd like to add something to embellish this breakthrough of the Minchas Chinuch. You may recall 2 weeks ago, because last week I was up in the north, but 2 weeks ago we discussed two different dimensions of chet. Chet, on the one hand, generates a chiyuv onesh, because ein chet below onesh. That's one of the tenets of our faith. And on the other hand, chet is pogem and mitame the person, the nefesh ha'adam. This, I believe, is the background to understanding the Minchas Chinuch. If I borrow money from you, I owe you a chov. If a man does a chet, he owes a chov to the Ribono Shalom, and he's got to pay it up. If you're talking to me about the other dimension of chet, not the onesh, which is a chiyuv, you're talking about how the chet contaminates the nefesh of the adam, I don't need viduy. Viduy is part of mechila, which means kapara. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, you know what? You don't have to pay me back. Ki'ilu es kabalti. It's as if I received my payment. For that, you need X, Y, and Z. In this case, you need viduy, and tshuva is not enough. But if you're talking about the impact of chet on the nefesh ha'adam, the soul that's been contaminated, for that, tshuva could operate successfully even without viduy. And therefore, when he made a condition in the Kedushin, al menashani tzaddik, he was able to remove the stain and the contamination of his sin with a sincere hira tshuva. You ask me whether he has to pay up his chov, whether he has achieved kapar. The answer is no. He's got to pay up his chov. He owes HaKadosh Baruch Hu nonesh. Because chet is mechayev and nonesh. And hira tshuva is not enough to generate a payment, ki'ilu es kabalti, and a kapar. The Arzarua, one of the Chachmei Ashkenaz, seems to indicate that in order for a person to be a tzaddik, even from now and forward, he must add viduy to his tshuva. Viduy, according to the Arzarua, is an integral part of tshuva. There's no tshuva without viduy. So therefore, the purpose of viduy is not just l'sha'avar, to remove the punishment from the past deeds, the way the Minchas Chinuch said, but even li'asid, even moving forward, we need viduy. And this can be explained based on the language of the Sefer HaChinuch in Mitzvah Shin Samach Dal. Why is the Torah so careful and so demanding that viduy has to be viduy dvarim, viduy bepeh? He's got to enunciate it verbally, besfasav. Why isn't it enough that he thinks his Viduy and he regrets his sin internally? Says the Sefer Achinuch, the recitation of Viduy has a tremendous impact on the psyche of man. Mitoch sheyazkir sachet b'sfasav, says the Sefer Achinuch, Yischarit olav, he'll have charota, and more important, yizoyer, yoser, b'pam acheres, he'll be more careful if he faces the same challenge. Shelo yeh nichshal bo. Because achrei sheyomar kazeh v'kazeh asisi, when he says those words, then he will not want to repeat that same sin. It's very, when a person says, this is what I sinned, and this is what I did wrong, and when he verbalizes that and he hears that, it has a tremendous impact on him to protect him and prevent him in the future. David?
Yeah, so what does the Orizur do with the Gemara that the guy says, Al Nashri Tzedek?
I don't know. A great question. I had the same question.
Okay.
He says the following. Beautiful. Let's look at the psukim at the beginning of Bereshis, after the Chet of Adam Arishon. Vayetzav Hashem Elokim al ha'adam lemar, me'etz hadas tov v'ra lo sochal mimenu. That pasuk in the second chapter of Bereshis, in pasuk Teshuva, is before the sin. And God says, Lamar, here's the content of my mandate. But fast forward to Ber Gimel, after the sin. And the pasuk says, Gimel Yud Zayin, Vatochal mina eitz, she ate from the tree, Asher tzivisich, Lamar, lo sochal mimenu. What is the word lamar here? God is telling Adam that I told her not to eat, and she ate. Why add the word lamar? It's totally superfluous. So Rav Mirsky quotes a sefer, I'm not familiar with it, Shema Shlomo, from one of the Sfaradim, Rab Nisan Shlomo Al-Ghazi. And he says the following. God was afraid that man will forget his sin because he'll forget the violation and the tzivui, the formulation, the mandate that God gave him. So God commands man lamar. What does lamar mean? Lamar, you should repeat the Isser. I want you to repeat word for word what I told you you're not allowed to do. And always you should review Hashem tzivani lo lechom eitz hadas tov v'ra. Kidei shelo yishkach es ha'Isser. He should never forget the Isser going forward. And he quotes a commentary here. I'm not sure who it is. He says Savos, I don't know. Anyway, he says the following. We'll just wrap this up. The Shulchan Aruch says that you're not allowed to read on Shabbos to the Or HaNer. However, you're allowed to read, says the Shulchan Aruch, this is in Simon Reish Ayin Ches, you're allowed to read Perek B'Mem Hadlikin, the Or HaNer. We're not afraid Shemiyata that if the candle diminishes, he might tip it over. Why? Says the Mechaber, Rav Yosef Cairo, Mutar likro Perek B'Mem Hadlikin Or Shareu Mazkir Iser Shabbos V'Eich Yishkach. He is repeating the words of the Mishnah that you're not allowed to be mata the ner. How could he possibly forget? And now he quotes a Savos Rivash. I really don't know who that is. Who says in Mis'ava Adam Liez Avera, this is an unbelievable statement. If you have a taiva for an Avera, Yomar, he should recite the Psukim Shel Avera, And you should read it b'tamei hamikra, u'b'nekudos, b'dechilu rechimu, with fear, v'oz yelech mimenu atayvu. I don't know. It's worth a try, I guess. And apparently the Baal Shem knew about this insight of the Tzavos HaRivash, and he says that a person should constantly repeat the Isur if he sees Takfa Yitzro, his Yitzro is getting the best of him. And here we want to conclude with the last paragraph on page 177. Why do we recite Viduy B'Loshen Rav? Ashamnu, Bagadnu, Gazalnu. And the answer is that the judgment on high is on two different levels. On the Yachid, on the individual as a Yachid, and on the Tzibur, when the Tzibur and the generation as a community is guilty of sin. And therefore, the Pasuk tells me in Vayikra Chava, Visvadu es avonom ves avonavosam. Avonavosam is an allusion to the Tzibur. And that's why we use the Lashon Rabim Asham. And what a person is basically saying is, number one, I confess my guilt on an individual level as a Yachid, and number two, if I contributed to the Tzibur, and as a member of that community, I also have taken part in that Avera, then I want to recite Viduy for my chelik, my contribution to the Avera of the Tzibur. And therefore, Viduy, in the language of both Chatasi and Chatanu, is a very powerful tool. And we end, L'may nechtal, mileches, shova, b'darkei alev, v'noshu, b'tshuva, shlema. Amen.
Amen.
B'tz Hashem, next week we'll have a discussion about Chodesh El. It'll be a little bit late. Maybe I should have given it today. But okay then. So have a wonderful week. And thank you as always for participating in the show.
Thank you, Rav. Thank you very much. Kol tov.
Okay, bye-bye.